So I'm Steve Cody. I'm that guy. And just a quick correction, Ed. There is a guy named Emil in Estonia who is also a chief comedy officer.
That's not true.
Clayton is one of two true chief comedy officers. So just a couple of things. We're used to performing. I do stand-up as a hobby. He does it as a full-time job. He daylights, if you will, as chief comedy officer at Peppercom. We're used to performing at 8 o'clock, but usually it's p.m., not a.m. So that 2-drink minimum is really important for us this evening. Just a couple of quick things before we get started. I was going to ask you a question, and I know it's early, but we're talking about culture, and we're talking about comedy as a cultural change agent. So if you could be honest with me about your organization, how many of you would describe your culture as good? How many? Just raise your hands. How many? Excellent. And how many would you say it's fair or mediocre? Thank you. And how many, like my firm, would describe it as purely toxic? Thank you. You and I will have an off-site. Thank you. It's interesting. We did some research, and Ed spoke about some of the most admired corporations, best workplaces. There are also quite a few surveys. There's a professor at the Tuck School who really looks into toxic workplaces. There's a website called 24/7 Wall Street that rates the worst CEOs and the worst workplaces. And it's interesting, both surveys used more or less the same words when reporting back from an employee and a middle management standpoint why those cultures were so bad. And they used words like micromanagement, a perception that senior management was being unfair, some people feeling, and I'm not going to name names here of companies, but some people feeling there's too much change, others feeling it's stagnant and there's no change at all in the organization. And then in terms of describing the person sitting in the corner office, he or she, and these are usually Fortune 1000 companies, as seen as being too immature, egomaniacal, totally clueless between the gap between what he or she makes and the average employee makes, and outright lies about there being a work-life balance.
Dish Network. They're the worst.
Dish Network was...
They're number one.
You weren't supposed to out anyone, but Dish Network...
They're the worst.
...was twice named America's meanest company. And that's something that Peppercom aspires to one day.
Right. We're working on it.
We're working on it. Comedy has been a big deal for us, and comedy was the #1 driver why Crane's New York Business named us this past year the top workplace in Manhattan. We topped 930 other companies, and the independent panel of judges said it was because comedy had really transformed our culture, and it has. Not that it was toxic. I wouldn't even call it mediocre. I think we've always had an open, engaging culture, but by bringing comedy in as a regular part of our management training, it's really metamorphosed the agency. It's really flattened, and everyone talks about a flattened organization. It's really flattened the organization because all of us participate. Senior management gets up there and we show our vulnerability. It really works. It's differentiated us in terms of attracting and retaining employees, and it's been a huge hit from a business development standpoint. In fact, 2 of our biggest clients say the reason they selected us was because we were so irreverent, edgy, and made them laugh. Mini Cooper and Whirlpool. So this is a bottom line benefit that we totally stumbled across. When I say stumbled, Clayton stumbled across me. I was face down on a street corner. And he picked me up and he said, "Would you like to perform stand-up comedy?"
Okay, now here's how it really happened. Steve was a performer in a show that I was hosting at Caroline's Comedy Club. And I knew that it was new comedians that were sort of making their debuts. I guess he had taken a class. And after he got off stage, I made the mistake of encouraging him. I said, I know I don't know you, we've never met before. I just wanted to say that I thought you were very funny, and I think that you could, if you want to continue in stand-up comedy, if it's not something you just wanted to try once, I think you could do this. So he said, well, would you want to help me? And I became his personal comedy coach for a number of years.
I used the word egomaniacal before. It definitely struck a chord when you said it.
Yeah,
so I found over a course of 2 years performing stand-up as a hobby, once a week, and with Clayton's coaching, literally like an NFL football coach does on Monday morning, we would videotape and look at what I did well and obviously what I didn't do well. I was getting a little bit better on stage, but all of a sudden I noticed in the workplace, I was becoming a much better listener. I was learning how to build rapport. I was learning how to make eye contact. All of these subtle changes, and I said to Clayton, I think this might work at my firm.
And it has. That was about 8 years ago. And to this day, whenever a new employee joins Peppercom, one of the first things they have to do is go through stand-up comedy training, led by me and Steve, and we teach them what we know about comedy. And it's not to torture them, although that's a small part of it. It's mostly to help them learn a little bit about our culture, because the company itself has a culture that is infused with comedic elements. It's not a place where we bring rubber chickens and bicycle horns to work every day, and slip on banana peels and things like that, but it's a place where it's okay to laugh and it's okay to have fun at work. And that's the culture that we've created that, you know, again, as Steve mentioned, we were named #1 by Crane.
And it gave us our rallying cry for this year, nowhere to go but down.
Right. We're already #1, so.
I think it's important, too, that we're not talking about joke telling. This is storytelling, and it's based upon the truth. And if you can talk about how the connection between stand-up comedy and business works in terms of authenticity.
Sure. So in the last several years, we've identified through all the different companies that we've helped 4 elements of a successful or a healthy culture in the workforce. And the 4 elements that we've identified are trust, authenticity, openness, and teamwork.
Or TAOT.
It's a great acronym for TAOT.
TAOT.
So comedians know a lot about these 4 things because they're also, coincidentally, essential elements of a great comedy performance. There has to be trust, there has to be teamwork, there has to be openness, and there has to be authenticity. So what we do through our comedy training and the different comedy styles that we learn about and the techniques that we learn, whether it be stand-up comedy or improv skills and things of that nature. Screenwriting, we talk about how to put together a good script. We look at a business presentation as a form of theater, and so we approach it in that way. And we draw on my theatrical background. I have a degree in theater, and I spent many years directing plays and things like that.
And I was a grip.
He was key grip for one of the films that I worked on. Long story short, we have learned that there are things that comedians and other performing artists know that business people should know if they want to learn how to improve the culture in their workplace.
And here's the interesting thing, at least from my perspective. We did this selfishly for ourselves. It was working, we were seeing tangible results, and our trade media found out about it, so they started writing about it. And that percolated up to the mainstream business press, and they started writing about it. And MSNBC did an 8-minute segment on it. And all of a sudden, companies started calling us and saying, can you do this for our workforce? Can you do this for our sales force? So this is one of those rare exceptions where a market found a service. And it's now become a revenue stream at Peppercom.
And just to give a quick example of one way that this affected our company, because I know some of you are thinking, how did this exactly happen? And we have countless examples, but just to give one that's probably tangible to most of you, Peppercom was asked to be a part of a large banquet dinner where many, many PR companies were going to be showing videos to introduce their companies. And by and large, these videos were boring and sort of stagnant, and just basically, we are headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. Our CEO is William Smith, and just one after the other. And so Steve's idea was, well, why don't we bring in our comedy guy to try to make this a little bit more interesting? So he asked me to creatively do the same thing with our video, but to set ourselves apart. And what we did is we infused it with comedy. So what we actually did was an attack ad against Peppercom, as though we were a candidate running for office against Peppercom. So we did things like you might see in a political attack ad, like Peppercom claims that they have a successful workplace culture, but do they really? And then black and white and blood on the screen and just trying to create
to
a
Clayton's
thing like that.
point, and getting back to the toxic workplaces, we're not suggesting that comedy can be a cultural change agent in those organizations where the culture doesn't allow it. Peppercom is very open, always has been. Those clients that have come to us have that corner office mentality of wanting authenticity, of wanting to be genuine, and being self-deprecating in the way they communicate. So for example, we work with a major oral care company, and they brought us in to work with 3 separate divisions that were completely siloed. I kid you not, dental floss, toothpaste, and mouthwash. And they hated one another. Hated one another.
Those floss guys are real jerks.
They're tough. So what they asked us to do, and what we did, was they broke them down and put them together, and we put them through 7 separate sessions of stand-up comedy training in which each had to come up and tell a story. What they do is they come up and tell a 3 or 4 minute story about something that ticks them off. Could be their boss, could be their wife, could be their commute. If, like me, you're a New York Mets or Jets fan, it could be your sports team. And what happens is remarkable. A, with a little coaching, they're always funny to some degree. Some are laugh out loud funny. B, everyone in that crowd rallies around them and supports them because they themselves know they have to get up and perform. I have never seen bonding like this.
Stand-up comedy is a combination of art and science. You have to be artistic in that you have to be able to creatively express whatever opinion you're trying to express or whatever story you're trying to tell. But there's a science to it. We break comedy down into its bare bones elements. I'm talking about punchlines and setups and the different types of storytelling, and I give them instruction on how to do that so that they're not just blindly standing on stage and saying, oh, I'm just going to wing it now and try to be funny. So they have an idea of how to make it work. And we have found through the years that learning these techniques are also, there are uses for these techniques in other areas of life besides when you're actually on stage trying to be funny. And so we apply them to our everyday, our day-to-day.
Well, it's interesting, and we've been hired by some of the most serious businesses. You might think, well, I'm a defense contractor, my company, there's no way we can inject comedy. We've worked for a defense contractor. We've worked for doctors and nurses treating stage 4 cancer patients. We've worked for pharmaceutical companies selling very, very serious products. And when push comes to shove, with the doctors and nurses, for example, it was all about improving their listening skills, their bedside manners, their empathy, being able to build rapport, because as they told us, you just don't learn that at Johns Hopkins. With the sales forces, they were selling a commodity, and what they needed to do was, when push comes to shove, and I believe when all things are equal, the customer will select that group with whom he or she bonds in that meeting. Comedy enables you to better bond with whomever, whether it's one-to-one, one-to-many, or many-to-many. So it's a huge competitive advantage when used properly.
Absolutely. So what we'd like to do next is talk a little bit about these different elements, and maybe you can think about your own workplace culture and how they apply. As Steve mentioned, there's a list of all these companies that don't have a successful workplace.
Peppercom.
Number 1, Dish Network. They're horrible. So do you have trust? And what does that mean? Well, I know as a comedian, it's important that the audience and I have a relationship of trust. They have to believe that I'm going to be able to make them laugh, and I have to trust that they're going to allow me to do my job. And you may have been to a comedy show before where that trust broke down and disaster struck in the form of a heckler. So what we've learned is, for example, at Peppercom, all of our office doors are made of glass, and generally they're always open. So having that openness and that trust and be able to, keep the lines of communication open is extremely important, so that you don't have a culture of, well, we have a dictator and then we have minions, and that's what you want to avoid.
Except at Peppercom. But the other point is, and I know this is a challenge for all of us, what we do and what we found is extremely effective is mixing and matching the generations, as well as breaking down the divisions and the units. By mixing and matching the millennials with the boomers, with the Gen Xers, they bond naturally because they need to support one another in that environment. The other big pain point that clients come to us for is something we're trying to demonstrate today. Too many executives are totally dependent upon PowerPoint. And the companies really want them to be able to look at the audience, engage with the audience, and cut the umbilical cord.
Right. Yeah, because when you're standing behind a podium and you're just talking about your slides, you're not really bringing your personality to your presentation. So what we learn to do is what comedians have to do, which is basically just stand there with nothing between us and vulnerable.
Yeah, we are dressed, but we are naked.
Right, yeah. There is a very naked feeling when you're not relying on...
And the other really cool tangible... I love to interrupt this man.
That's okay.
The other really cool tangible that everyone comes to us afterwards and says, boy, having done stand-up comedy in front of my peers, I can make that presentation, that business presentation next week, that'll be a piece of cake. And 9 times out of 10, you just feel so much more relaxed after having gone through this. If you feel like, it's almost like having served in Vietnam, I would assume. Having gone through that, you can do anything. You can plow through any wall.
And we speak to a lot of companies that claim to have a strong culture in there. And you know, I humbly submit that many of them are wrong. They suggest that their culture is fun. Many times you hear that word on the phone when we're speaking with a new client. They'll say, oh, we have a really fun culture. And we ask them, well, what does that mean? And they have trouble defining that. We think that using comedy techniques is a much more tangible approach to actually creating fun. And a lot of companies think that creating teamwork, again, one of the essential elements of a good culture is teamwork. You know, if you think of the old days, 50 or 60 years ago, team building and teamwork in the workforce was basically these silly exercises like a potato sack race around the office or a trust fall. I'm going to fall back and hopefully you'll catch me. And those techniques are dated and they're just not as useful as they may have been 50 or 60 years ago because the culture of the world right now is based in reality. So there's nothing real about doing a potato sack race together. But if I can hear a story about Steve's teenage son or something that happened with your husband or anything like that.
Something I don't?
So
we are T-minus 44.
Well, this actually started a little late, so we have a few.
Do we have more than T-minus 44 yet, or are we T-minus 44? We're down to 30.
You told us we had 20 minutes. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Ed.
It was on 17.
I didn't know if that was like Moscow. Yeah. I didn't know what was going on. It's like a red signal here.
I'm trained to always look at the teleprompter, so I know it was at 17 when we started.
Oh.
So, but just to complete the point I was making there about the team building, we find that these old techniques don't really have the impact that they may have had in the past. And what we have seen is that when a group goes through comedy training together, with the Vietnam analogy that Steve made a moment ago, the team building that takes place is very strong and powerful because when your coworker is on stage sharing something personal from his or her life, you can't help but root for that person because the vulnerability that comes through and just the sense of truth that takes place, along with it being funny, there's honesty there. And that's the first lesson we give when we teach stand-up comedy. Number one weapon that you have at your disposal is the truth. So we ask everyone, don't try to be funny. Let's just tell a true story and we'll find ways to make it fun.
That's really where comedy and business intersect. Authenticity. Because every organization wants, from an oral and written standpoint, to be seen as transparent and authentic. And that's what we enforce in our comedy training.
The two buzzwords we hear the most, authenticity and storytelling. And I see some of you nodding your heads because these are words that are being thrown around quite a bit. But what we're trying to do is help you bridge the gap between using words like authenticity and storytelling and actually bringing those words to life in the day-to-day in your office. And we find that using the same techniques that comedians use is extremely powerful and effective in accomplishing that goal.
And in wrapping up, thank you so much for having us here. But with 3 key questions to ask yourself. Number one, is your organization ready to embrace something like stand-up comedy? We are not suggesting, as I said, it's right for everyone. But would this not be a phenomenal opportunity for you to become the empowerment agent within your organization if authenticity, storytelling, and a better workplace culture is what you're after? And number 3 is really about storytelling. Storytelling based upon authenticity is really the currency of the realm right now. And that's what stand-up comedy training produces. The final thing I wanted to add before we say sayonara is it's all measurable, and we can talk about that during the break. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.